The signature was steady. That was the detail. Mrs. Evangeline Thorne had been 73 years old, arthritic in both hands, and in the final fortnight of her life, unable to hold a teaspoon without it rattling against the saucer. Her doctor had recorded the tremor in writing. Her housekeeper had cut her meat for her at supper. And yet the will she signed 4 days before her death, the will that disinherited her only nephew and left the whole of Thornfield House to a woman no one in the village had ever met, bore a signature as firm and unhurried as a schoolmistress marking an exercise book. A frightened woman, the solicitor later said, does not write a steady hand, unless, of course, she is not the one holding the pen. Welcome to Marple Mysteries. Tonight's case takes us to the quiet Cotswold village of Chipping-Combe, where a dying woman's last wishes were witnessed, sealed, and filed in perfect order, and where every clause of that document tells a lie. This is the last will of a frightened woman. Chapter 1. The House on Willow Lane. Chipping-Combe was the sort of village one passed through without noticing, and those who lived there preferred it that way. It sat in a fold of the Cotswolds, where the lanes narrowed to single tracks between dry stone walls. And the church clock, by long tradition and general agreement, ran 4 minutes slow. There were 2 public houses, a post office that also sold wool, and a vicarage whose garden was the envy of 3 neighbouring parishes. Miss Jane Marple, visiting her old friend Dolly Bantry for the first weeks of October, had declared on her second morning that it reminded her a great deal of St. Mary Mead, only with rather better roses. It was on the afternoon of the 7th of October that Dolly came in from the village with a letter in one hand and a face arranged into what Miss Marple had long ago learned to recognise as the particular expression of a woman trying very hard not to seem delighted. "Jane," she said, setting the letter on the tea-tray, "do you remember I mentioned Evangeline Thorne?" "The lady at Thornfield House," said Miss Marple, without looking up from her knitting. "The one who had not been seen in the village since Easter. She died on Tuesday." Miss Marple's needles paused for perhaps half a second, then resumed. "I'm sorry to hear it. She was not old, I think, by the standards of such things." 73. "And the village is in an absolute state, Jane, absolutely. Not because she died. Everyone had rather expected it, you know, with the heart trouble, but because of the will. Ah, her nephew Gerald gets nothing, not a teaspoon. The whole estate, the house, the land, the pictures, the lot, has gone to a Miss Cecily Vane. Nobody has heard of her. Nobody in Chipping-Combe has ever laid eyes on her. And the will was signed, my dear, 4 days before Evangeline died." Miss Marple set down her knitting at last, and looked at her friend with the mild, untroubled attentiveness of a person watching a cat approach a closed cupboard. 4 days, she said, 4 days. Mr. Pritchard, the solicitor, you met him at the vicarage tea. He drew it up himself and witnessed it at the house. He says Evangeline was perfectly clear in her mind. He says she asked for the changes herself. He says, and here Dolly lowered her voice slightly, though there was no one else in the room, that she seemed frightened. Frightened of what? He would not say, or could not. You know how he is. Miss Marple took up her knitting again, and began very slowly, the turn of a heel. Outside, a wood-pigeon called twice, and was answered by another further off, in the direction of the churchyard. The fire shifted in the grate. "And the nephew?" she asked. "Gerald. He is staying at the Fox and Grapes. He has been there since Wednesday. He will not go up to the house. He will not speak to Pritchard. He sits in the saloon bar from 11 until 3, and he drinks what Mrs. Ludlow, the landlady, describes as a remarkable quantity of bitter for a man in mourning. And Miss Cecily Vane? No one knows. No one has seen her. Pritchard has written to her at a London address, but the letter came back. The house is shut up. The housekeeper, a Mrs. Bellamy, who was with Evangeline for 30 years, has been given notice. Miss Marple was silent for a long moment. The pigeon called again. "Dolly," she said at last, "did your letter this morning happen to be from Mr. Pritchard?" Dolly Bantry had the grace to look, for an instant, a little pink. "He wondered," she said, "whether you might perhaps walk up to Thornfield House with him tomorrow. Only to look, Jane. Only to look at the study where the will was signed. He says, and I think this is rather the point, he says the inkwell is wrong. The inkwell! The inkwell on the desk, he remembers it particularly. And when he went back yesterday, it had been moved." Miss Marple laid down her knitting for the second time that afternoon. "How curious," she said softly. "How very curious indeed." The morning of the 8th of October came in grey and still, with a fine mist clinging to the hedgerows and the smell of wood smoke drifting across the lanes from the cottages at the lower end of the village. Miss Marple, who had slept indifferently, was downstairs before Dolly's maid had finished laying the breakfast things. She took a single piece of toast, drank half a cup of tea, and was standing at the window with her gloves in her hand when Mr. Pritchard's dog-cart turned in at the gate. He was a small, precise man of 60-odd years, with the dry manner common to country solicitors and a habit of clearing his throat before every third sentence. He helped Miss Marple into the cart with exaggerated care, as though she were made of glass, and they set off up the Willow Lane Hill, at the steady pace of a horse that had climbed it every week for a decade. "I am much obliged to you, Miss Marple," he said when they had cleared the last of the cottages. "Mrs. Bantry speaks very highly of your powers of observation." "Dolly is very kind," said Miss Marple. "Tell me about the inkwell, Mr. Pritchard." He cleared his throat. "Well, it is a trifle, perhaps, but it has been upon my mind. When I attended Mrs. Thorne on the 3rd of October, that is the day she signed the new will, we sat together at the desk in her study. She preferred to sign at the desk rather than in the drawing-room, though I own it would have been more comfortable. The inkwell she used was a silver one, engraved with her initials, E.T., and it stood always on the left-hand side of the blotter. Always, Miss Marple. I have known that desk for 22 years, and yesterday the inkwell stood on the right, and it was not the same inkwell." Miss Marple turned her head slightly. "Not the same. A plain glass one, quite ordinary. The silver one was gone. When I remarked upon it to Mrs. Bellamy, she said only that she had not been into the study since the day her mistress died, and that Mr. Gerald had asked for the key on Thursday morning and had kept it since." "Dear me," said Miss Marple. They went on in silence for a little. The lane rose between two high banks of old beech hedge, and the mist thickened as they climbed, so that the horse's ears seemed to swim in and out of view. Presently the banks fell away, and Thornfield House appeared, a grey Queen Anne front set back from the road behind a pair of stone gateposts, with a cedar upon the lawn that must have been planted 200 years ago. Mrs. Bellamy opened the door to them. She was a tall, spare woman of perhaps 60, with a face that had been handsome once, and was now settled into the particular composure of a servant who has seen a great deal and does not intend to discuss any of it. She greeted Mr. Pritchard civilly, and Miss Marple more civilly still, and she led them through the hall to the study without a word of comment. The study lay at the back of the house, and looked out upon a walled kitchen garden. It was a small room, panelled in oak, with a single large window, a fireplace in which the ashes of a recent fire still lay, and a writing desk set crosswise to the light. Upon the desk stood a plain glass inkwell, a blotter, and a silver paper knife. Miss Marple did not approach the desk at once. She stood in the doorway for nearly a full minute, her hands folded upon her reticule, and she looked, quietly, methodically, at each corner of the room in turn. "Mr. Pritchard," she said at last, "where was Mrs. Thorne sitting when she signed?" "In the chair by the desk, Miss Marple, with her back to the window." "With her back to the window," repeated Miss Marple, "so that the light fell upon the page." "Precisely. And the witnesses, myself and Dr. Havers from the village. We stood, as is customary, a little behind her." Miss Marple moved at last. She crossed to the desk, laid her hand lightly upon the back of the chair, and looked down at the blotter. It was fresh, quite clean, quite unmarked. She turned it over. The underside was clean also. "A new blotter," she said. "I beg your pardon?" "A new blotter, Mr. Pritchard. On the 3rd of October, did Mrs. Thorne sign her name with a fresh pen, or with one from the tray?" He considered. "From the tray, I believe. Her own pen, a tortoise shell." "And is it there now?" They looked together. The pen tray held 2 ordinary steel-nibbed pens and a pencil. The tortoise-shell pen was not there. Mrs. Bellamy, who had remained in the doorway, cleared her throat softly. "Mr. Gerald took the pen, madam," she said, "on Thursday. He said it had been his uncle's, and he wished to have it." "His uncle's," said Miss Marple, "not his aunt's. He said his uncle's, madam. I remember it particularly." Miss Marple was silent. Her eyes rested on the clean blotter, and her small pink pursed mouth had gone thoughtful. "How very strange," she said at last, "that a man should wish so particularly to remove the pen with which his aunt signed him out of her will." They came down from Thornfield House a little before noon. The mist had lifted into a thin, high cloud, and the sun was making a poor effort to break through above the church tower. Mr. Pritchard was silent for most of the descent, his chin drawn down into his collar, and Miss Marple did not press him. She had observed long ago that solicitors in distress preferred to arrive at their conclusions unassisted, and would resent any attempt to hurry them. At the bottom of Willow Lane, he roused himself. "Miss Marple," he said, "I am bound to tell you that what you have remarked upon, the blotter, the pen, the inkwell, would not, I fear, stand as evidence of anything whatsoever in a court of law. Mr. Gerald is the lady's nephew. He is entitled to take a memento. A housekeeper may renew a blotter. An inkwell may be broken and replaced." "Oh, certainly," said Miss Marple. "All of that is perfectly true." "And yet you are troubled. I am troubled, Mr. Pritchard, by the steadiness of the signature. You said yourself that she seemed frightened. A frightened woman does not write a firm hand, and a woman with arthritis in both her wrists, for Dr. Havers has told half the village about it, does not write a firm hand either. Yet the signature on that will is, you tell me, quite unshaken." "It is." "Then either Mrs. Thorne was not frightened on the afternoon of the 3rd, or she was not the one who signed." "Mr." Pritchard looked straight ahead between the horse's ears. "Miss Marple," he said very carefully, "I witnessed the signature myself. I saw her hand upon the pen. I do not doubt it for an instant. I wonder only whether you saw what you thought you saw." He made no answer. The dog-cart rattled over the little bridge at the foot of the hill, and the first of the cottages came into view. "I should like," said Miss Marple, "to look in at the Fox and Grapes before I go home to luncheon. Dolly has told me a great deal about Mrs. Ludlow, and I have always thought one may learn a great deal more at an inn between 12 and 1 than at a solicitor's office in any hour of the day." Mr. Pritchard set her down at the door of the inn, and drove on without a word. The Fox and Grapes was a low, whitewashed building set back a little from the road, with a wooden bench beneath the bow window, and a black cat asleep upon it. Miss Marple paused for a moment at the door to adjust her gloves, and in that moment she took in, through the open window, the whole of the saloon bar. The two old men at the corner table, who had been there, she was certain, since opening. The farmer by the fire in gaiters. And at the table nearest the window, alone, a young man of perhaps 30, with a half-finished glass of bitter in his hand, and a newspaper open before him which he was not reading. She went in, made her way to the counter, and asked Mrs. Ludlow, very politely, whether a pot of tea might be had. Mrs. Ludlow was a woman of comfortable proportions and quick eyes, and she recognized Miss Marple at once as Mrs. Bantry's guest. The tea was brought in a very short time, and a plate of biscuits with it, and Miss Marple settled herself at a small table not 3 feet from the young man with the newspaper. For some minutes she said nothing. She poured her tea, took a biscuit, and looked out of the window at the cat. "A pleasant animal," she observed, to no one in particular. "My niece has one very like it, only rather stouter." The young man lifted his eyes from the newspaper. They were, Miss Marple noted, bloodshot, and the shadows beneath them had the settled look of 2 or 3 nights' poor sleep. "A stouter cat," he said, with an attempt at a smile. "One hopes it is well fed, then." "Oh, exceedingly. My niece is a very soft-hearted woman." She paused, and then, with the mild innocence of an old lady making conversation in a strange inn, "I am staying with Mrs. Bantry. I had heard there was a sad business in the village this week. A lady at the great house, I understood." The young man's hand closed round his glass. "My aunt," he said shortly, "Evangeline Thorne. Oh dear, I am very sorry. Forgive me, I did not know. No matter. You will be Mr. Gerald Thorne, then?" "I will." Miss Marple inclined her head in sympathy, and said nothing more for perhaps a minute. She watched, without appearing to watch, the way his thumb worked at the rim of his glass. "Forgive an old woman's curiosity," she said at last, "but I understood from Mrs. Bantry that your aunt was taken rather suddenly at the end." "Suddenly enough." "And yet she had time, I gather, to set her affairs in order." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and for an instant Miss Marple saw something in his face that was not grief, and was not anger, but something older and more exhausted than either. She had time, he said, to do what someone told her to do. And he drained his glass, and stood up, and walked out of the inn without another word. Miss Marple remained at her table for some minutes after Gerald Thorne had gone. She finished her tea without hurry, crumbled the half of her biscuit for the cat at the window, and then asked Mrs. Ludlow, with the gentle persistence of an old lady who liked a little gossip with her biscuits, whether the poor young gentleman had been long at the inn. "Since Wednesday evening, ma'am," said Mrs. Ludlow, who required no great encouragement. He came down on the last train from London, and he came straight here from the station. He has not been up to the house once, to my certain knowledge. Not once, Mr. Pritchard has called upon him twice, and he will not see him. The vicar looked in on Friday, and he was civil enough, but he would not be drawn. He writes letters, ma'am, a great many letters, and he pays Tom Ludlow 6pence a time to take them down to the post before the evening collection. A great many letters, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. To London, perhaps? All to London, ma'am. I have seen the addresses when I take up his breakfast tray. All to one firm, I believe, in Lincoln's Inn. Ah! Miss Marple paid for her tea, added 6pence for Mrs. Ludlow's trouble, and walked out into the thin October sunshine with her reticule upon her arm and her mind, to an observer, occupied chiefly with the question of whether the cat was quite as well fed as it appeared. In fact, her mind was occupied with the figure of a young man writing letter after letter to a firm in Lincoln's Inn, and refusing to enter the house to which, in the common course of things, he had every expectation of being heir. She walked slowly home by way of the churchyard. Mrs. Bantry, who had been looking out at the drawing-room window for the better part of half an hour, met her in the hall. "Jane, there has been a letter, by the second post. For me, Dolly? For you, from Mr. Pritchard. He sent his boy down with it not 20 minutes ago." The letter was short, written in Mr. Pritchard's precise, rather cramped hand upon the headed paper of his firm. Miss Marple read it standing at the hall table, and then read it a second time with a small, thoughtful compression of her lips. "Dear Miss Marple," it ran, "after I set you down at the inn this morning, I returned to my office and put in hand the matter we had touched upon. I have this afternoon received, by the 2 o'clock post, a reply from my London correspondents in the matter of Miss Cecily Vane. You will recall that the letter I sent to the address given in the will was returned marked not known. My correspondents have now ascertained, with some certainty, that no person of the name of Cecily Vane has ever resided at that address, and indeed no person of the name appears in any of the directories of the last 10 years. I should be much obliged if you would call upon me at my office at your earliest convenience. Yours very truly, H.J. Pritchard." Miss Marple folded the letter once and slipped it into her reticule. "Dolly," she said, "I am afraid I shall not be in to luncheon after all. Would you be very kind and tell cook? Jane, what has happened?" "Miss Cecily Vane, my dear, appears not to exist." Mr. Pritchard's office stood above the chemist's in the village high street. It was reached by a narrow wooden staircase, and it smelt faintly of old paper and of the beeswax with which his clerk polished the banister every Monday morning. Miss Marple was shown up directly. He rose as she entered, closed the door himself, and waved her to the leather chair opposite his desk. "You have read my note?" "I have. I will not conceal from you, Miss Marple, that I am very much disturbed. A beneficiary who cannot be found is one thing. A beneficiary who does not exist is another altogether. I have been at the bar 41 years, and I have never before drawn up a will in favour of a person who has no existence in the world." "And yet," said Miss Marple gently, "Mrs. Thorne gave you the name herself." "She did. She gave me the name, the address, and a short description. A lady of middle age, she said, to whom she had become much attached through correspondence upon matters of a religious nature. She said it was her wish that her estate should pass to this lady absolutely, and to her nephew nothing. A correspondence upon religious matters. Those were her words. Did she show you any of the letters? She did not. I did not ask to see them. It was not, you understand, my place. Miss Marple sat very still for a moment, her gloved hands folded in her lap. "Mr. Pritchard," she said at last, "I should like, if it can be managed, to see Mrs. Thorne's writing desk again. Not the study desk, the small one, the bureau I observed in the window of the morning room upstairs. There was a lock upon it. I have the keys of the house, Miss Marple. I can take you up this afternoon." "Then let us go at once, because I very much fear, Mr. Pritchard, that the letters from Miss Cecily Vane, if they exist at all, will not remain in that bureau for very many more hours." They walked up to Thornfield House together, for Mr. Pritchard had sent his dog-cart back to the livery, and there was not time, he said, to fetch it again. The afternoon had grown warmer, and the cloud had thinned into that pale, washed blue which only October gives. A blackbird sang somewhere in the hedgerow. Miss Marple walked a little more slowly than she had walked in the morning, and her eyes, behind their pale lashes, did not seem to rest very long upon any one thing. "Mr. Pritchard," she said when they were halfway up the hill, "when you and Dr. Havers witnessed the will, was Mrs. Bellamy in the house?" "She was. She brought in the tea-tray when we had finished. And before you arrived, who was with Mrs. Thorne before you arrived?" He considered. "Mrs. Bellamy, I presume, and the nurse, a young woman from the village called Annie Poole. Dr. Havers had recommended her a fortnight earlier, when Mrs. Thorne's heart first began to trouble her seriously." "Annie Poole," said Miss Marple. "You know her?" "I have not yet had the pleasure, but Mrs. Bantry mentioned the name at breakfast yesterday. She is a niece, I understand, of Mrs. Ludlow at the Fox and Grapes." "Indeed, a good family, perfectly respectable." "Oh, quite," said Miss Marple, and said no more. Mrs. Bellamy admitted them for the second time that day, and if she was surprised to see them again so soon, she gave no sign of it. She led them, at Mr. Pritchard's request, not to the study but up the broad oak staircase to the first floor, and along a corridor hung with sporting prints to a door at the end. "The morning room, madam," she said, and stepped aside. It was a pleasant room, south-facing, with a bow window that looked out over the cedar upon the lawn. A work-basket stood beside an armchair. A Bible lay open upon a small table, and between the two tall windows, against the wall, stood the bureau Miss Marple had come to see. It was a small walnut piece of the last century, with a full front and 4 drawers beneath. The key was in the lock. Miss Marple regarded it for some seconds without moving. Then she turned to Mrs. Bellamy. "Mrs. Bellamy," she said, "was this bureau locked upon the morning of your mistress's death?" "It was, madam. It was always locked. Mrs. Thorne carried the key upon her chatelaine." "And where is the chatelaine now?" "In the top drawer of her dressing-table, madam. I put it there myself on the Tuesday morning, when she had no further need of it." "And the key of the bureau was upon it then?" Mrs. Bellamy hesitated. It was the first hesitation Miss Marple had observed in her. "I could not say for certain, madam. I did not count the keys." "Thank you," said Miss Marple. She stepped forward, and very gently, as though the little piece of furniture were itself a living thing that might take alarm, she turned the key and let down the full front. The interior was fitted with the usual small drawers and pigeonholes of such a piece. A half-used sheet of writing paper lay upon the leather, and beside it a bottle of violet ink. In the central pigeonhole stood a packet of letters tied with a piece of black ribbon. Mr. Pritchard drew in his breath. Miss Marple did not touch the packet at once. She looked first at the writing paper, then at the ink bottle, then at the pigeonholes on either side. One of the small drawers, she observed, was fractionally open, not more than the thickness of a penny, and she drew it out with the tip of her finger. It was empty, but upon the bare wood of its bottom there lay, quite distinct in the afternoon light, the faint rectangular mark of dust, where a second packet of letters had lately stood and was now gone. "Ah," said Miss Marple, very softly. She closed the drawer and took up the packet from the pigeonhole and carried it to the window. The ribbon was tied in a bow, not a knot. Miss Marple noted this and said nothing of it. She drew the bow, and the ribbon fell away, and there were perhaps a dozen letters in all, each in its envelope, each addressed in the same small upright hand to Mrs. Evangeline Thorne, Thornfield House, Chipping Combe, and each postmarked London, W.C. She opened the uppermost. It was a short letter upon thin paper, and it was signed "Your affectionate friend" in the Lord Cecily vein. It spoke of prayer, of the comforts of Scripture, of a small chapel in Bloomsbury where the writer attended Sunday worship. It spoke, too, very gently, very sorrowfully, of a nephew, unnamed, whose conduct had grieved his aunt, and of the writer's own conviction that a just providence would not suffer an ungrateful man to inherit what a faithful one had built. Miss Marple read it through twice. Then she folded it, replaced it in its envelope, and looked up at Mr. Pritchard with an expression he did not quite know how to read. "Mr. Pritchard," she said, "these letters are a forgery." "A forgery? My dear Miss Marple, not of the handwriting, of the sentiment. No woman who truly prayed in a chapel in Bloomsbury would write quite so many letters quite so usefully. And no packet that has been read and reread by a dying woman is tied afterwards in a bow." They did not take the letters away. Mr. Pritchard would have had them in his pocket within the minute, but Miss Marple stayed his hand with a small gesture. "No, Mr. Pritchard, leave them where they lie. If they are moved now, we shall have given warning, and whoever took the other packet from the empty drawer will be on his guard, or on her guard, before nightfall. Let them stay, and let the bureau remain unlocked, precisely as we found it. It is, I think, more important to see who comes for them than to have them ourselves." He looked doubtful, but he yielded. They closed the full front, turned the key back to the position in which they had found it, and withdrew. Downstairs, Mrs. Bellamy was waiting in the hall with a composed face and a duster in her hand. "Mrs. Bellamy," said Miss Marple, in the mildest of voices, "I wonder if I might trouble you for the address of Annie Poole. I should rather like to speak to her, merely to offer a word of sympathy, you understand. I am told she nursed Mrs. Thorne very devotedly." "She did, madam. Annie lives with her mother at Rose Cottage, the third on the left past the smithy. She's at home this afternoon, I believe. She has not taken another place since Tuesday." "Thank you. You are very good." Miss Marple and Mr. Pritchard parted at the gate. He was for his office and a glass of sherry, he said, and a quiet half-hour with the codicil to a farmer's will in the next parish. Miss Marple was for Rose Cottage. It was a very small cottage, set behind a low privet hedge, with a patch of Michaelmas daisies in the front garden and a wooden bench beside the door. A woman of about 50 opened to Miss Marple's knock, Annie's mother evidently, and upon hearing the errand showed her, with a flustered civility, into the parlour. Annie Poole sat by the window with a piece of plain sewing in her lap, She was perhaps 22, fair-haired, with a round and pleasant face which had been at some recent hour crying. She rose when Miss Marple entered and bobbed a small old-fashioned curtsy that she had plainly learned from her mother. "Please do not get up on my account, my dear," said Miss Marple. "I am only an old woman who has heard good things of you, and who thought you might like a little company this afternoon." Annie coloured and sat down again, and laid her sewing aside. Miss Marple talked at first of very ordinary things, of the lateness of the apples, of Mrs. Ludlow's rheumatism, of the new curate at St. Jude's, and she let the girl settle a little before she came quite gently to her point. "I understand, my dear, that you were with poor Mrs. Thorne at the last." "I was, ma'am. 3 weeks and 4 days I was with her. I was there when she died." "It must have been a great distress to you." "It was, ma'am. She was very kind to me. She was—" The girl swallowed. "She was not what they say in the village, ma'am. She was not a hard woman. She was only frightened." "Frightened of what, Annie?" The girl looked down at her hands. "I should not say, ma'am. No, of course not. It would not be right. But I wonder whether at any time in the last week of her life she had a visitor whom you did not know." Annie looked up sharply. "How did you know that, ma'am?" "I did not know, my dear. I only wondered." "There was a lady," said Annie, after a little pause. "She came on the Friday before Mrs. Thorne died. She came in a motor, and she stayed rather more than an hour, and she went away before tea. Mrs. Bellamy let her in, and Mrs. Bellamy let her out, and I did not see her face at all. I only heard her voice through the drawing-room door when I carried up the coal." "And the voice? It was not a lady's voice, ma'am. Not quite. It was very careful, if you understand me. Too careful. Like a person reading aloud from a book." "Ah, and when she had gone, ma'am, Mrs. Thorne would not touch her supper. She sat in the armchair by the fire, and she held her hands together in her lap. And she said it twice, ma'am. I remember it exactly. 'I must do as I am told. I must do as I am told.'" Miss Marple was silent for a long moment. "Annie," she said at last, "did Mrs. Thorne ever speak to you of a lady called Cecily Vane?" "Never, ma'am, not once." "And had letters come for her from London in the weeks before you arrived? Or while you were with her?" Annie thought. "There were letters, ma'am, yes. But she did not read them while I was in the room. She put them in her pocket, and she took them away upstairs." "Upstairs to the morning room?" "Yes, ma'am. That was her own room. She had it to herself." Miss Marple rose and took the girl's hand for a moment and thanked her. At the door she paused. "Annie, the lady who came in the motor on Friday, was she tall or short?" "Tall, ma'am. Taller than most gentlemen. I saw her shadow in the hall." The 3 of them sat long over the table that evening. The candles burned down to half their length, and the port went round once, and then a second time, and still no one rose. Mrs. Bantry, who had tact enough to know when a conversation was not for her, had withdrawn to the drawing-room with her embroidery after the cheese. "Dr. Havers," said Miss Marple at last, "I should like to ask you something which may seem a little impertinent. How long had you known Mrs. Thorne?" 26 years, Miss Marple. I came to Chipping-Combe as a young man of 34, and she was among my first patients." "Then you knew her husband?" "I knew Colonel Thorne, yes. A fine man. He died in, let me think, in the spring of 1912. A riding accident. He was found on the bridle path above the cedar wood. His horse had come home alone. A riding accident, Miss Marple repeated. So it was given out. And so I believe it was. You had no doubt upon the point. I had none, Miss Marple. I attended him myself. His neck was broken. The ground was soft from rain. The horse was a young animal, and a hard one to handle. It was a perfectly intelligible accident. And Mrs. Thorne, how did she bear it? Very ill at the time. She kept to the house for nearly a year. She saw no one but her sister, who came up from Hampshire to sit with her. Her sister, said Miss Marple. Is the sister living still? She died before the war, of influenza, I believe. And did the sister leave children? One son, the nephew, Gerald. Miss Marple turned her glass slowly between her fingers. Dr. Havers, one further question, and I will trouble you no more tonight. Had Mrs. Thorne any other living kin at the time of her death? Any other person who might, in the ordinary course, have expected some mention in her will? The doctor thought for a long moment. None that I know of, he said at last. The Colonel had a younger brother, but he was killed at Spine Cop in 1900 and left no issue. So far as I am aware, Gerald was her only blood relation in the world. Her only blood relation, said Miss Marple. Mr. Pritchard walked home by the churchyard path, and Dr. Havers took the lane that led past the smithy, and Miss Marple, having seen them both to the gate, returned into the drawing-room and sat down opposite her friend at the fire. Dolly, yes, Jane. Do you by any chance remember Evangeline Thorne as a young woman, before she was married? Mrs. Bantry lowered her embroidery. I did not know her then, Jane. I knew her only after I came to live at Gossington, but Arthur's mother knew her very well indeed. They were girls together at some sort of establishment in Paris. There used to be a photograph of the two of them upon Arthur's mother's mantelpiece. A silver frame. A photograph. Yes, 4 or 5 girls together, in those great white dresses they wore. I believe the frame came to us when Arthur's mother died. It must be in the morning-room cupboard still. Dolly, would it be very troublesome for you to find it? It was not troublesome. Mrs. Bantry was gone perhaps 10 minutes, and when she came back she had the frame in her hand. She gave it to Miss Marple and resumed her chair. It was a carte de visite, mounted behind glass, a little foxed at the edges. 5 young women stood in a row against a painted backcloth of a garden. 2 were seated upon a bench in front of the others. All wore white. All had their hair drawn up in the fashion of the late 90s. The names had been written in a careful hand upon the back of the card. Paris, June 1897. Miss Marple studied the faces for a long time. This one, she said, indicating the tallest of the standing figures, is this Evangeline? That is Evangeline. You can see her nose. She always had that nose. And this one, beside her. I do not know, Jane. Arthur's mother would have known. Miss Marple turned the card over and read the names aloud, very slowly, in the order in which they had been written. Evangeline Harper, Mary Colworth, Laura Denvers, Charlotte Peake, Cecily Vane. The fire hissed upon a damp log. Mrs. Bantry's embroidery slid from her lap and lay unnoticed upon the rug. Jane, she said, in a voice hardly above a whisper. Jane, the name in the telegram. The companion who inherited was not that. Laura Denvers, yes, Dolly, Laura Denvers. Miss Marple turned the card once more and looked down at the 5 faces in their white dresses, and at the second figure from the left, tall already, at 19, a plain face, but a watchful one. So they were all at school together, she said, Evangeline, and Cecily, and Laura, 30 years ago, and more. And Cecily Vane died 11 months since. and left what little she had to Laura Denvers. And Laura Denvers, I think we may be quite certain of it now, has been writing letters to Evangeline from a dead woman's name. But why, Jane? Why take so much trouble for a name? Because a stranger, Dolly, could not have made Evangeline frightened. Only an old friend could do that. Only someone who knew the thing Evangeline had been frightened of for 30 years. Miss Marple slept very little that night. She heard the church clock strike each of the small hours in turn. And at 5:30, when the first grey of the morning came in at the window, she rose and dressed and went downstairs to the kitchen, where she made herself a pot of tea and sat at the scrubbed table with the silver frame before her and the 5 faces in their white dresses looking up at her in the lamplight. Only an old friend could make a woman frightened, she had said to Dolly the night before. And that was true, but it was not the whole of the truth. There was something more, something which had begun, if she was not mistaken, not 11 months ago with Cecily Vane's death, nor 3 weeks ago with Annie Poole's arrival at Thornfield House, but far earlier than either of those. It had begun perhaps on a wet spring morning in 1912, on a bridle path above a cedar wood, when a horse had come home alone. A perfectly intelligible accident, Dr. Havers had called it. And so, very likely, it had seemed at the time. But accidents which are perfectly intelligible are the ones which most often repay a second look. At 7 she wrote a short note to Mr. Pritchard, and gave it to the milk boy to carry down to his house. At 8 she took her breakfast with Mrs. Bantry, and spoke of the weather, and of the prospects for the harvest festival, and of nothing else. At 9:30 she put on her walking shoes, took her stick from the hall stand, and set out alone up the Willow Lane hill. She did not this time go up to the house. She turned instead at the little iron gate which gave upon the grounds, and took the path which skirted the kitchen garden wall, and rose between 2 rows of beeches to the high ground behind Thornfield. The bridle path she had heard Dr. Havers speak of lay, she believed, some 1/4 of a mile above the house, where the wood thinned into open pasture. It was a fine, still morning. The beech leaves had begun to turn, and underfoot the path was thick with the season's first fall. Miss Marple walked slowly, her eyes upon the ground, her stick tapping gently before her. The cedar wood lay upon her left. She came to the end of it, and the pasture opened, and the bridle path ran along the crest of the rise with a low post and rail fence upon one side, and the drop into the wood upon the other. She stood for a little while at the place where, as nearly as she could judge from what Dr. Havers had said, Colonel Thorne had been found. The ground was firm. It had not rained for a week. But she had not come to look at the ground. She had come to look at the view. From the bridle path one could see quite plainly the whole of the rear of Thornfield House, the walled kitchen garden, the glass of the conservatory, the window of the study where the will had been signed, and above it the bow window of the morning room. Any person standing upon this path, at any hour of any day, could see into those rooms with nothing more than a pair of field glasses. And any person standing at those windows could, with equal ease, look up and see the bridle path. Miss Marple stood a long time, and then she turned and walked back down the way she had come. Mr. Pritchard was waiting for her in the drawing-room when she returned. He rose as she came in, and she saw at once from his face that something fresh had occurred. "Mr. Pritchard, you have news." "I have, Miss Marple." 2 pieces of news, and I do not know which is the graver. First, the packet of letters in the bureau has gone. Gone. I went up to the house at 9 this morning, as you suggested, to see whether anything had been disturbed. The fall front of the bureau stood open. The pigeonhole was empty. The ribbon lay upon the floor. Had anyone been into the house? Mrs. Bellamy says not, but Mrs. Bellamy was out between 7 and 8 to market. The back door was upon the latch. And the second piece of news? Mr. Pritchard drew a telegram from his pocket and laid it upon the table. From my London correspondence. They have traced Miss Laura Danvers. She is not in London. She left her lodgings in Bayswater upon the 18th of September and informed the landlady that she was going into the country to nurse a sick friend. She has not returned. She gave no forwarding address. The 18th of September, Miss Marple repeated softly, and Annie Poole was engaged to nurse Mrs. Thorne upon the 20th. So Dr. Havers informs me. Miss Marple sat down. She placed her gloves very carefully upon the table beside the telegram. Mr. Pritchard, how old, approximately, is Mrs. Bellamy? 60, I should say. Perhaps a year or two more. And how long has she been at Thornfield House? 30 years, Miss Marple. She came to Mrs. Thorne as a young woman, shortly after— He paused. Shortly after Colonel Thorne's death. Yes. Miss Marple nodded slowly, and her eyes travelled once more to the silver frame upon the side table, where 5 young women in white dresses stood in a summer garden in Paris. Mr. Pritchard, she said, I should be very much obliged if you would ask Mrs. Bellamy to call upon me this afternoon. Mrs. Bellamy came down to Mrs. Bantry's at a little after 3. She wore a black coat and a plain black hat, and she carried a leather bag upon her arm, which, Miss Marple noticed, she did not set down upon the hall stand, but kept close at her side as she was shown into the small sitting-room at the back of the house. It was a room which Mrs. Bantry kept for private conversations, and it had a pleasant view of the orchard and a door which could be shut. Miss Marple was waiting by the fire. She rose as Mrs. Bellamy entered and offered her a chair. It is very good of you to come, Mrs. Bellamy. Mr. Pritchard said that you wished to see me, madam. I did wish to see you. Please sit down. I'm afraid that what I have to say will not take very long, but it is of some importance. Mrs. Bellamy sat and folded her hands upon the bag in her lap, and waited. Her face, in the light from the window, was very still. Mrs. Bellamy, you have been 30 years at Thornfield House. I have, madam. You came there shortly after Colonel Thorne's death. In the July of that year, yes, madam. And in all the years since, you have been Mrs. Thorne's close companion as well as her housekeeper. You knew her habits, her correspondence, her fears. You knew, I think, the name of the thing she was most afraid of. Mrs. Bellamy said nothing. Mrs. Bellamy, when the lady in the motor car came to Thornfield on the Friday before last, you opened the door to her. You showed her into the drawing room. You showed her out again an hour later. And in all that time, Annie Poole, who was upstairs, did not once see her face. That is correct, madam. You knew her. A small pause. I had known her, madam, many years ago. At a school in Paris, perhaps? Mrs. Bellamy looked up. For a moment, the stillness of her face was disturbed by something. Surprise, Miss Marple thought, and underneath the surprise, a weary sort of relief. I was not at the school, madam. I was a maid in the house where the young ladies sometimes came of a Sunday. I knew Miss Evangeline Harper, and Miss Charlotte Peake, and Miss Mary Colworth. And I knew Miss Laura Danvers. And it was Miss Laura Danvers who came in the motor on Friday. It was, Mrs. Bellamy, I am going to tell you what I believe happened, and I want you to correct me if I am wrong. It will be easier for all of us. I think it will be easier for you if we have the truth plainly between us before Mr. Pritchard returns." Mrs. Bellamy inclined her head very slightly. "In the spring of 1912, said Miss Marple, Colonel Thorne was killed upon the bridle path above the cedar wood. It was given out as an accident, and no one questioned the verdict. But Mrs. Thorne did not keep to the house for a year out of grief alone. She kept to the house because she was afraid. And she was afraid, I believe, because she knew, or suspected, that her husband's death had not been an accident at all." Mrs. Bellamy's hands tightened upon the leather bag. She suspected someone. Perhaps someone close to her. Perhaps someone who had profited by the Colonel's death, or who had wished very particularly that he should not live. And for 30 years she carried that suspicion in silence, because she had no proof, and because to speak would have been to destroy, not the guilty person only, but herself and her household also. Madam, no, let me finish. 11 months ago, Cecily Vane died in a nursing home in Bayswater, and her companion, Laura Denvers, inherited what little there was. And Laura Denvers, Mrs. Bellamy, had been at that same school in Paris. She had known Evangeline Harper when both were 19. And she knew, because old friends always know such things, what it was that Evangeline had been frightened of all those years. "She knew, madam," said Mrs. Bellamy, very low. "She knew it all. So she began to write letters. She used the name of a dead woman, the safest name in the world, for a dead woman writes no contradictions. She made herself an affectionate friend in the Lord. She wrote of Scripture and of prayer, and very gradually of a nephew whose conduct had grieved his aunt. And when the letters had done their work, she came down herself, in a motor car with a hired chauffeur, and she sat for an hour in the drawing-room of Thornfield House, and she told Mrs. Thorne what she would do if Mrs. Thorne did not sign the will that had already been prepared. Mrs. Bellamy's eyes had filled. "And she said, I let her in, madam. I let her in and I let her out, and I said nothing, because I, too, had been afraid for 30 years. "Afraid of what, Mrs. Bellamy?" "Of the same thing, madam. Of what I had seen from the kitchen window upon the morning the Colonel died. I saw someone come down off the bridle path, madam, and it was not the horse that had thrown him." Miss Marple sat very still. "Who did you see, Mrs. Bellamy?" "I saw his nephew, madam. I saw young Mr. Gerald. He was 12 years old." It was arranged for the following afternoon, at 4 o'clock, in the drawing-room of Thornfield House. Mr. Pritchard had sent the notes himself, by hand, and had worded each of them with the careful ambiguity of a solicitor who has been 41 years at the bar, and knows precisely how much may be said and how little. They came in ones and twos. Dr. Havers first, very grave in his black coat. Then Annie Poole, shy and frightened, with her mother's shawl about her shoulders. Then Mrs. Bellamy, who admitted them all, and then took her own place upon a straight-backed chair beside the door. And last of all, at 4:15, Mr. Gerald Thorne, who had walked up from the Fox and Grapes with his hat in his hand, and his face the colour of clean paper. Miss Marple sat in the low chair by the fire. The silver frame with its 5 faces in white dresses stood upon the small table at her elbow. The packet of letters, the ones which had been stolen, and which Mr. Pritchard had recovered that morning from the left luggage office at Paddington Station, where a thin man in a grey chauffeur's coat had deposited them, lay beside the frame. And in the chair opposite Miss Marple, brought down by the afternoon train, and by Inspector Craddock of the county police, sat a tall woman of perhaps 50, with a plain, watchful face, and a pair of grey eyes that moved very little. Miss Laura Danvers had at last come to Chipping Combe. "I shall not keep you long," said Miss Marple, in her mildest voice. "There are only 3 things which it seems to me must be said aloud, because they have been said too long in whispers, and whispers in this house have done a great deal of harm." She turned first to Gerald. "Mr. Thorne, 32 years ago, upon the bridle path above the cedar wood, you were present when your uncle was thrown from his horse. You were 12 years old. You did not push him. You did not strike him. But you saw him fall, and you saw that he did not rise again, and you ran away down the path, and you told no one what you had seen. Is that not so?" Gerald Thorne looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once. "I was afraid, Miss Marple. I had been forbidden to go up there. I thought, if I said I had been there, they would think I had done it. I was 12. I ran home by the back way, and I washed my boots in the scullery, and I said nothing. And for 32 years I have said nothing." "And your aunt, Mr. Thorne, did she know you had been there?" "She knew. She saw my boots. She said not a word to me about it, then or ever, but she knew. And from that day she was changed toward me, not unkind, only watchful." "She was watchful," said Miss Marple, "because she believed what Mrs. Bellamy also believed, that you had seen not an accident but a crime. And she believed it for 30 years, in silence, because she did not know who the murderer had been, and because she could not bear to ask. Mrs. Bellamy, will you tell Mr. Thorne now what you saw from the kitchen window that morning?" Mrs. Bellamy rose. Her hands were trembling. "I saw you come down off the path, Mr. Gerald. Only you. I saw no one else. For 30 years I thought you had killed him, and I said nothing because I had been fond of you as a boy, and because your aunt had begged me, with her eyes, never to speak." "But she was wrong, Mrs. Bellamy," said Miss Marple quietly, "and so were you, because there was someone else upon that path that morning, and Colonel Thorne's neck was broken not by his horse, but by a blow from behind, delivered by a person who had every reason to wish him dead, and no reason whatsoever to wish him alive." She turned in her chair. "Miss Danvers." Laura Danvers did not move. "You were at school with Evangeline Harper in Paris in 1897. You were her friend. And in the spring of 1911, a year before the Colonel's death, you came to stay at Thornfield House for 6 weeks. Dr. Havers has been good enough to look up his old case book. You were here, Miss Danvers. You knew the bridle path. You knew the Colonel. And you knew, because Evangeline in her innocence had told you, that the Colonel had discovered something about your past, which he intended, upon his return from London, to lay before his solicitors. A forged signature, was it not, Miss Danvers? Upon a small legacy from an elderly aunt of your own? A matter of £200, perhaps. Not a great sum, but enough in 1912 to have sent you to penal servitude." Laura Danvers's grey eyes at last moved. They moved to the packet of letters upon the table, and then to Miss Marple's face, and then away again. "You killed him upon the bridle path," said Miss Marple, "and you went quietly back to London, and for 30 years you were safe, because the only witness was a frightened child who dared not speak, and a frightened housekeeper who suspected the wrong person. And then Cecily Vane died, and left you her name and her small means, and you saw your chance to come back a second time, not for £200 now, but for Thornfield House itself. You used the name of a dead friend because Evangeline would trust it. You reminded her, in your letters, of the nephew whose conduct had grieved her, meaning the boy whom she had believed all those years to be her husband's murderer. And when she was sufficiently frightened and sufficiently ill, you came down in a hired motor car, and you told her what you would say at the inquest into her husband's death if she did not sign the will you had prepared. She signed it, Miss Denvers, because she believed she was protecting the nephew she had wronged for 30 years by her silence. She signed it with a steady hand, because terror, in certain natures, steadies the hand rather than shakes it. And 4 days later she died, of a heart which could bear no more, with perhaps a little assistance, I think, from the digitalis bottle, which stood upon her bedside table. Inspector Craddock rose from his chair by the window. "Laura Denvers," he said, "I must ask you to come with me." She went without a word. Outside, the October dusk was drawing in across the cedar. Mr. Pritchard folded the recovered will and placed it in his pocket. Gerald Thorne stood by the window with his face turned away, and Mrs. Bellamy, very quietly, had begun to weep. Miss Marple picked up the silver frame and looked once more at the 5 young women in their white dresses in the summer garden in Paris. "Poor Evangeline," she said softly. "She was frightened of the wrong person for 30 years. That, I think, was the saddest thing of all." And she set the frame gently down, and rose and went home to Mrs. Bantry's for tea.